Matt Pearsall. I am the community manager here in the SEL and education community, and I'm really excited to bring the next of our SEL education speaker series events to y'all. Today we are going to be meeting with Jordan Posamentier, the director of policy and advocacy at Committee for Children. We got to talk to him a couple weeks ago about the intersection of social emotional learning and equity, and we're going to be returning again to talk with him some more today with the subject of trauma-informed practices and trauma-informed education. And so thank you very much, Jordan, for joining us. And
good to be here again.
Let's jump right in. So Jordan, when we talk about trauma, what is trauma? Let's level set a little bit to begin with, because I think it can mean a lot of different things to people.
Yeah, sure, Matt, thank you. Let's start with how people, I think everyone has a sense of what trauma means, but it occurs when someone experiences or witnesses something that can be frightening or threatening or harmful, and it often elicits a really strong response. Examples might include abuse, neglect, community violence, loss, war, serious accidents, illness, incidents of racism, and the list goes on, but that gives you a good sense of where trauma might show up. And in youth, in particular, what we've seen in the literature is an examination of what's referred to as adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. Those are traumatic events or experiences that happen before a young person turns 18, and they are linked to a lot of challenges in adulthood. I should add, it's actually a significant and ubiquitous problem in young people than we realize. Let's talk stats. So I borrowed these from a group called Child Trend. Just under half, about 45% of children in the US have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, but 1 in 10 nationally experienced 3 or more. And that places them in an especially high risk category for some of the trouble that you get when you're a grown up. The CDC says the good news that positive factors like social emotional learning can serve as a means to prevent ACEs and maybe bring down some of the prevalence rate and allows kids to manage ACEs so those things don't manifest into trouble when you're a grown-up.
Mm-hmm. So trauma-informed approaches to education, what does that look like? What is this? How does this show up for those of us who are working with kids?
Yeah, there's a lot of action going on trying to reconcile what it means to do trauma-informed practice, trauma-sensitive practice, trauma-informed approaches, a lot of names. But basically all these orbit around the idea that education involves an awareness and a responsiveness to trauma so that we cultivate safe and supportive learning environments. The aim here is that these approaches can limit exposure to triggers or risks for kids and to promote these protective factors like social emotional learning and supports that end up fostering resilience. They help young people deal more effectively with their response to stressful events and managing through those stressful events. Can I give you an example?
Yeah, absolutely, please.
So let's just picture a teacher sees a student's eyes wandering off a writing assignment, and the teacher asks for the student to refocus on the work. Let's say the student's response is to yell no, gets out of their seat, throws a paper or pencil across the room, kicks the chair. All right, so we're seeing a heightened experience going on in the classroom from what otherwise is a pretty normal redirect to focus on these. So a teacher without a trauma-informed approach might think, what's wrong with this kid? And now I need to be the enforcer and demand compliance. A teacher with a trauma-informed approach might think instead, what's going on here? What's happening with this kid? Maybe the fight or flight reflex is kicking in a response to a perceived threat or a danger. So rather than just forcing compliance, take a step back and think, what can we do to help this kid feel safe and once again ready to learn?
So why do trauma-informed approaches to education matter for racial equity? What's the connection here between the two?
Sure, and for folks who've been watching the series, we have been drawing the linkages between the connections with SEL and other things, especially racial equity, especially given what's now being called the racial reckoning that the country is experiencing and paying a lot more attention to. So let's go back to the Child Trend stat. Children of different races and ethnicities, they don't experience adverse childhood events equally. Nationally, 61% of Black non-Hispanic kids and 51% of Hispanic kids have experienced at least one ACE, compared with 40%, much lower, of white non-Hispanic children, and only 23% of Asian non-Hispanic children. In every region, the prevalence of ACEs is lowest among Asian non-Hispanic kids, but in most regions, it's highest among Black non-Hispanic children,
Mm.
which means that these populations are experiencing higher rates of traumatic experience and events. Let's add to that, when we talk about trauma, we also look at specific commonly occurring types of trauma, specifically racial trauma,
Hmm.
historical trauma, and those, of course, will happen more significantly with students of color, young people of color.
Hmm.
Um, Racial trauma is really stressful. It impacts students emotionally, and that experience of racial discrimination or
Hmm.
and prejudice is quite prevalent. We talked last time that a kid can experience up to 5 instances of discrimination a day, a child of
Mm.
color. So you combine all that and get historical trauma as well. That's a type of
Yep.
trauma that a
Yep.
kid,
But
yeah,
yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, because
yeah,
that's a new term. I think I've only just begun to hear about.
sure. And this literature has been around now, and now education's paying a lot more attention to it. It's the idea that a community might experience this increased historical trauma based on trauma that's been passed down through generations.
Hmm.
Real clear examples have to do with refugees who are displaced during war or
Hmm.
famine.
Hmm.
And you'll see this both racial and historic trauma can impact a kid's well-being. It has systemic implications on
Yeah.
things like test scores and
Hmm.
graduation rates. It continues to be at issue when we think about racial equity in
Yeah.
education. So it really pays for educators to pay particular attention to these issues.
Yeah, and I appreciate that's interesting, that the connection between this racial trauma as kind of you were thinking about it in the context of schools in the United States, but there's this research that connects back to kids that are experiencing who are refugees or experiencing adverse experiences due to conflict, and more that we've had guests here in the SEL education community who have talked about just that, from like from the UN or from other aid agencies, who have talked specifically about how they are using social emotional learning to address the trauma that the kids that they serve are experiencing, and really I think highlights that this is much more than just a U.S. issue.
Yes, indeed.
So what is the role that social emotional learning can play in this? Where does social emotional learning fit into trauma informed education?
Sure. So here we get to talk a little bit about some of the positive responses we can produce, and SEL, social emotional learning, overlaps significantly and thereby contributes a lot to strongly trauma informed approaches.
Hmm.
Both trauma informed approaches and SEL work together to create safe and supportive learning environments. Sometimes when I'm talking to policymakers, it's real quick to help them understand. If you say an emotionally regulated young person is a young person ready to learn, how do we, good luck trying to teach a child who's dysregulated from having a fight in the hallway, or their parent lost their job. Those are issues that will impede a student's learning experience, and it's important that we tend to them. How do we help these kids emotionally regulate and get ready to learn? One answer among several, we can work on skill building in the social emotional learning domain.
Hmm.
Beyond emotional regulation, SEL also plays a role securing supportive relationships, developing a sense of self-efficacy.
Hmm.
Both these can all protect against negative effects resulting from trauma. And I should add, it's I don't want to say it's a one-size-fits-all approach, right? It's we got a lot to learn with how this works pedagogically. So the idea to apply all this in the same setting, same children, think twice about that. But
Hmm.
uh, we do have a little bit of an explanation for how to differentiate.
Hmm.
Trauma-informed approaches have to be culturally responsive.
Mm.
Uh, Means that when dealing with trauma that stems from like racial trauma, historical trauma, we have to think about each child in their context and what's the appropriate response, what's the appropriate trauma-informed response.
Hmm.
And I'll just say, if you ignore this, if trauma-informed approaches try to not pay attention to a child's cultural, ethnic, racial background,
Hmm.
uh, the effort could fail, or
Hmm.
worse, it could re-traumatize somebody.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. When that really resonates with me, and I think back to my own experience as a teacher at a school that had a really high Asian immigrant population, and we had students who we had students who were coming to our school directly from refugee camps in Southeast Asia, Burmese refugees. But then we also had students who had born and raised right here in the United States, whose parents had been refugees from Khmer Rouge, and also students whose parents who'd been members of the Khmer Rouge and then been refugees from the Vietnamese. So we had all of these different contexts. When I stepped into that, I didn't really recognize all of the different kind of things that were going on for our students, but it's kind of was immersed in that for a while to recognize that there's very different, that arriving in the United States as a refugee or as children of refugee doesn't, there's so many different ways and shapes and forms that can take.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you're a policy person, and I was always interested to hear your takes on this. What is the policy angle on this? How are our states and the federal government addressing this here in the United States?
All right, it's policy time. There is a lot of buzz going on around trauma-informed, both federally and at the state level, cross party lines. People are really picking up, especially now during the pandemic, how important it is to become aware of and respond productively to experiences of trauma. I know we did a scan a couple of years back, Committee for Children did, about how advancing trauma-informed approaches work in policy, and the efforts are increasing. And to be fair, they're increasing now on account of the pandemic and racial injustices. But I think they would have kept increasing because last year alone, pre-pandemic, Committee for Children tracked and advocated more than 100 bills related to trauma-informed practices. And that's at the state level. But I'll give you a couple examples of the states that, just a couple. There's a bill in Indiana that went through in the 2020 legislative session that required treatment of trauma in teacher preparation programs. So they get the need for education for educators on this topic. A bill passed in Pennsylvania the year before that, 2019, to incentivize implementing trauma-informed approaches to curriculum and professional development. Those are just really bare highlights. Congress gets in on the game too. They introduced the Rise from Trauma Act, and the idea there is to support a trauma-informed youth-serving workforce, and that legislation will probably continue into 2021 as well.
Cool. And I've got a couple links here I'm posting in for people who are interested in learning more about these different bills that are in the works. So what can we do? Where can we go to learn more and take action? Is there action that we can take?
Yeah, there's the do-it-yourself action on your own. You can take a look at the SEL and racial equity brief that we published. In there is the treatment of trauma-informed approaches that we discussed here. Another thing you can do, and it depends on what state you're in, but if there are still federal CARES dollars available, especially those that are in your governor's pocket, so they're called Governor's Emergency Relief Fund, if they're still available, you might urge your governor or your local education leaders to prioritize those dollars, their COVID-19 relief dollars, for developing and integrating trauma-informed approaches such as SEL. And we've got a pre-formatted letter. You can change that as you see fit, but we thought we'd help you along with it to send over to those leaders. And that helps them pay attention to it, consider it on the list of many things that they are currently mulling for what needs relief. And then, stay tuned. I'll continue to encourage folks to sign up to receive action alerts from us at key times specific to your state and or Congress, so that when these bills come up and those key moments when they have to keep moving forward, they'll hear from folks like you, because honestly, your voices matter so much more to your lawmakers than anything else.
And by you mean everybody out there who's watching this right now, not me.
You got it.
Because y'all are the ones whose voices really matter.
Yes, sir.
And you just had an alert that went out recently. It's for Washington State, residents of Washington State.
Yep, very similar. The idea here is there are CARES dollars sitting in the governor's coffers, and we were urging the governor to consider those dollars for social emotional learning for purposes of trauma-informed approach and otherwise.
All right. Well, I think we are at our time right now, Jordan. I want to just thank you so much for taking more time out of your day to come and speak with everyone here in the SEL education community about this really important topic. And let everybody know that if you've got questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. You may not be watching live, but you can still ask your questions, and we'll still see them. And if you are watching live, hello. And just to say, we're looking forward to keeping this conversation going. Let me throw this up on the screen here. No matter where you happen to be watching this video right now, you can come back to the SEL education community, and you can join in the conversations we're having there every day around issues like this. Also, I'm dropping into the chat right now a link where you can find the recording of this video as well as the other SEL education talks we've had recently, and go there. You can see Jordan's previous talk. You can see a lot of other great information from other SEL education members. So with that, thank you very much, Jordan, for joining us, and we will see you all for our next SEL education event coming up next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Take care. Bye now.